All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third episode of Arketi Live in 25. I'm Erica England, Vice President at Arketi Group, and I'm excited to have you join us for what promises to be a very timely conversation. Joining me today is Terry O'Hanlon, Chief Marketing Officer at Agilysys. Terry is an all-around spectacular B2B marketer and communicator who has worked across a wide range of industries at companies both public and private. Terry, thanks for being here and for the brainstorm that we had last week that really helped inform this conversation.
Sure thing. Thanks for asking me. It's always fun to revisit topics that, you should stay sharp on. So that I thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely. Well, quick reminder for everyone before we dive in, we are live. So viewers, if you have any thoughts or questions along the way, feel free to drop them in the chat. We will try to tackle as many of them as we can at the end of our conversation. But if there's any that we miss, we will follow up and get some answers to you afterwards. Now, let's talk about what happens when things go sideways. Crisis isn't exactly something that's exclusive to consumer brands, although sometimes that's what we initially associate it with. From cybersecurity threats and system outages to social backlash and unhappy vocal employees, B2B brands also are just as vulnerable, maybe even more so, some would argue, because we're not always ready when it happens, which is why we're getting together today. So, Terry, let's start with the obvious. Why do so many B2B companies still treat crisis planning as an afterthought?
So I tend to look at it as they're more optimistic than thinking about it as an afterthought. They think there's so much positive trajectory of messaging that you have to do in your B2B to educate a full cadre of audiences on what's so special about your technology. And I think we're all immersed in getting those positive messages across that, except for in siloed areas, like I think most people think about cyber breaches and they have a chief information security officer who's looking at that. Many people look at, product failures, but they do it in isolation. So it's not true crisis communication planning. Sometimes it's very departmentally specific, especially in cyber instances. And that's not really enough. We're not doing crisis communications the right way.
Right, exactly. And two, I think in a lot of instances, people just initially associate crisis communications with external, right? But
Yeah.
there's so many other audiences, to your point about, being in silos, communicating cross-functionally, and kind of opening your mind up to all the other audiences that a crisis impacts: employees, investors, advisors, etc.
Yeah, I think what's important to remember in the time of a crisis is everybody in your company is going to be communicating about it if it's a public, event. And so the very first audience you need to talk to are your customers. Are your employees, followed very closely by your customers in tandem, because anybody who knows, oh, that person works at that company, or don't you use that solution or work with that company, they're all going to be targeted for their comments. So being able to disseminate very quickly, the facts and the empathy and the what's next of any crisis to those key audiences is super important. And then if you're in an industry where industry analysts are influencers, it's important to get them involved. Obviously the media, and then any kind of stakeholder, like if you have a advisory board for your company, those are all the targets that the media is going to be reaching out to get a comment on a crisis. And if you haven't informed them ahead of time, you don't know what's going to be said. And plus, then those people will be on their back foot anyway. It's actually a courtesy to do the communication in advance.
Absolutely. So building on that a bit, when it comes to actually monitoring risks, how do you recommend teams distinguish between immediate issues, emerging trends, and long-term vulnerabilities? You had some really good examples when we chatted that involved Navy SEALs.
Well, what I brought up is the Navy SEALs have a mantra that in times of crisis and pressure, people actually don't rise to the occasion. They sink to their level of training. And so when they prepare their teams to go out on a mission, they actually acid test those missions with trials where unexpected things happen. And then they see how the team responds and then give them feedback and create a plan so that when they're actually in the field, they've probably already rehearsed anything that's going to happen. And what I shared with you is I worked for a financial electronic commerce company back in the early days before people, consumers especially, really had a trust of the internet. And we crisis planned 75 different scenarios, and you have to do that cross-functionally because it's the communications team isn't going to know everything, not only cross-functionally, but also up and down the organization. There's leadership, but then there are feet on the street, people who know the day-to-day operations and can help ideate. Well, if this went wrong, that would be bad because this would happen. And you would be surprised how many scenarios you can come up with. And then you rank those by, it's a matter, a little bit of science, the data, the likelihood of things happening. But it's a lot of gut too. So let's say you have a company that's in a tornado zone or hurricane zone. Well, that would be likely to happen, and you would rank that further up the scale than some other things. I think most people these days would rank a cybersecurity incident as likely just because, the bad actors are always evolving. So anyway, you do that, and then you scenario plan and get people in a room and brainstorm not only what you're going to say, but who are the message carriers and who are the message receivers and how are those ranked. And thinking of all that while you're not in a crisis is extremely helpful. And also you can argue back and forth with the other teams. What's more important? Who's more important? What's the best channel to communicate when you're not also anxious about making something happen right now? Because that's when mistakes happen, when you're acting before you have time to think.
Yeah. And I think too, it's a great exercise to help you start to identify gaps that you could maybe put things into motion to solve. So I think you brought up a great example too. Like if you don't currently have great relationships with the media or industry analysts, that's going to be problematic to you when a crisis occurs.
Yeah.
So start thinking about steps you can take to mitigate those issues, now before
Yep.
something bad happens.
Yep. Another thing that might seem surprising to some people, but it's actually relatively common, is actually not having good customer communication channels. A
Yes.
lot of times, especially in a SaaS company, you sign the customer, and then the people that you're communicating with regularly are the technical people, the people in billing, but you probably aren't, and many times aren't, but should be communicating with the leadership of that company. So look at how well developed your channels are for talking to people in various influence levels and power levels within a company, and make sure you have those built and you're at least communicating, not bombarding people, but at least have some kind of regular communication in non-crisis situations so that those channels are already built. And then of course today I was sharing with you, the example of communicating multi-channel across all media. Across all digital channels, because a lot of people aren't, checking their email. They're checking their digital news feeds, their Twitter, well, their X now, and to make sure that you're communicating across all of those. I brought up the example of Slack when they had an outage a couple of years ago, and they had an outage that was caused by something they did, a configuration issue on their end, but they communicate every 30 minutes, even just to let people know with empathy, we know you're suffering because your communication channel is down and we're on it. Even if the communication update was, we figured out this, but we're still not at the root. And that's okay to don't wait till you have all the answers. It's important to be communicating factually, but with empathy and understanding what the impact is to the people who use your technology. Put yourself in their shoes and communicate at that cadence of methodology.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's easy for people to think, okay, crisis planning, that means I have to get my canned responses together, but those don't work in
No.
those situations. I mean, certainly you can have a starting point, but it's going to be a dynamic situation.
Yes.
Focus on the facts, as you said, even if you don't have all of the details.
Yes.
I mean, not sharing anything is not really an option anymore. It's
Right.
just kind of letting people know that you're assessing the situation and,
Right.
can share more details as you have them. And empathy, as you mentioned, is so important, and the frequency with which you're updating people.
Yeah, it is. And a fact can be we've done these three things in our investigation of what happened. It doesn't have to be here's what happened, is a
Yeah,
fact. What you're doing is a fact. You should never communicate anything that isn't factual, but it's okay to say, here's the process. And that's where a crisis plan is really important because that's what you've mapped out. If a data breach happens, here are the processes that we'll go through to find the root cause. And if you ideate all the possible ways you could investigate that, you're pretty much going to be covered for anything that happens.
right. Right, right. So, drawing from your experience, I want to go back to what you shared a little bit just around scenario planning and dive
Mhm.
into simulations specifically. So, you've had some experience with this, you've run some simulations at previous
Mhm.
companies that you were at. Can you talk a little bit about what these are, what makes them successful, and why
Yeah.
B2B brands should really consider them?
Okay, great. Yes, a simulation, there are really two basic types. One type is everybody who's participating in the exercise knows it's a simulation. And the other type is they think it's really happening. And so I recommend working with an outside firm who can moderate it. I do believe it's important to have a crisis communications firm to help with all of this. Number one, while you're running your business and doing your regular communication, that group can be on top of what's happening in the industry. What are danger narratives that are going on surrounding your type of technology? What are your competitors up to? And they're just keeping you up to date on all of those things that are need to know but don't need to act yet, kinds of things, because we're all so busy acting on what we need to act on. So if people know it's a simulation, it's almost like a case study that a part of a narrative gets handed out. At 4:20 a.m., we discovered, there's been a breach and it's a bad actor who's been lurking in our system and they may have the access to these kinds of files. Boom. What do? And you see if everybody remembers and is on board and has that muscle memory about what to do. And then the next part of the scenario unfolds. Here's what happened now. Here's what we know now. In each portion of it, there's a more information that gets shared, and you see how the group reacts to assimilating what you found out into your communication plan, and how does that develop. The ones that you don't, where you think it's really happening, are actually quite nerve-wracking for everyone. but but and obviously some of the executives need to be in on it. So
Right.
instead of getting a piece of paper, here's what's happening, if somebody's coming in the room and going, we figured out the people are in Russia, or whatever they're sharing, and then the group moves forward. So I think we're all so busy, we don't have time to do that too often, but I actually think, like, 2 times a year, or at least 1 time a year, to run some scenario planning, especially if you're in a frequently crisis oriented business like financial, electronic commerce, or banking. I think it's important to do that.
Yeah, and also too, I mean, thinking about after, I mean, hopefully you're not in like a long-term crisis situation, but thinking about after the crisis unfolds and you've responded and things have somewhat settled, evaluating what went right, what went wrong, what needs to be changed. I think a lot of companies just say, whew, we passed that and let's move on to
I
happier
never want to
times.
think about that again.
Yeah, exactly. But it is important to come together again and just kind of keep refining things.
And I think when you do that, it's important to reach out to the audiences that were involved and get their perspective. Reach out to your industry analysts. What could we have done better? What did we do right? Reach out to your customers. Do the same thing. Your influencers, your lead investors or market makers. I think then you can be a true receiver of information, not deceiving yourself on how well you did.
Right. That's a great point. I want to switch gears just a little bit and talk about your perspective on maybe how and when to lean in versus stay quiet when competitors face a crisis.
Yeah, I think if a competitor has a crisis around an issue that is really one of your strengths and part of your DNA, I think you take that opportunity to communicate, not about the competitor, but the narrative in the market is, I'll give you an example. Again, on the cyber front, I work for a company where having Six Sigma processes across all areas of the business, because trust was number one. Anybody who's on our system has to trust it. And once you lose trust, you've lost trust, especially in the early days of transacting on the internet. And when one of our competitors would have an issue, a data issue, we wouldn't say, oh, they had a data issue because they're not as great as we are. But we would run ads about the importance of Six Sigma processes and safety and investment and thinking ahead of the curve on every single thing that could go wrong. And that's why you can trust us, because this is our number one investment is your security. And because the narrative out in the market is, are people worried about security? That's going to land on some very receptive ears. I think if you don't have anything positive to say about your own company and somebody reaches out to you because they know you're a competitor, I think it's important to talk about what the industry is doing to protect, or guard against whatever the disaster was. For example, in the hotel industry, there's been a couple of data breaches lately, largely with very large properties that also have casinos. And there are several hospitality organizations that really pumped up the investments that they're doing for to educate their members, and not only to educate them, but to help them enact security policies. And all of us who were contacted were, giving out those messages, because rather than harp on this one breach, it's like, but look at this blanket of protection that the industry itself is putting forward. And that gives you the opportunity to be a thought leader and an honorable member of the community, rather than, never be a bully or attack a competitor. It's not productive.
No, I think that's great advice. I mean, certainly it could happen to anybody at any time. So,
That's a really good point. So don't go bragging too much. And
exactly.
actually, that's a really good point to make. Like the industry and all of the participants realize these types of things are vulnerabilities for all of us who are choosing to participate in this industry. That's why it's important to do XYZ, and why we invest this amount of money, this amount of time, this amount of people in being ahead of the things that could happen.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to, if we can, narrow it down to one thing you think more CMOs and comms leaders should be doing to pressure test their existing crisis communications plans. If we have some folks who are, in the middle of planning or reevaluating their plans, what should they be looking at?
So, Erica, I think like most things in life, communication is essential. And a lot of people may think, oh, I don't have time to update our plan, but you do have time to have conversations with your peers cross-functionally, and then that up and down, the hierarchy communication, touching base, breakfast, lunch, quick meetings, just to take a little bit of a temperature on, have things changed with regard to this risk? Here's what we've talked about. Do you see anything new happening? And that's good for your relationships across the company, and for you to make those little updates to your crisis plan. And if you do uncover something that has meaningfully changed, that would be a reason to call the full broader group back together to brainstorm on what to do. Like if there's an escalating risk, let's say your company is doing really well, but you're kind of small and there's some big players in the market and you think a hostile takeover might happen. And you hear that from the people in the finance office that they're worried about it or your investors are worried about. That would be something that you're not planning for every day. You have it in your plan, but it's not top of mind risk, but that could change where you think we better shore up this part of our plan.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think that helps the process of making updates more digestible. Like it's not a massive lift when you're just continuously in conversation. I mean, you should be doing this anyways, but
yes, exactly. That's the thing. And that's a good thing about crisis planning, actually, because it's a reminder to do that. You're absolutely right. We should be making the time to interact with our peers, not just about the day to day, but about the future and the environment and what's changing. And maybe crisis communications planning is a way to, put a frame around the point of the meeting and, get together with other people and have them make the time to meet with you too. Sometimes we do communications in isolation, and that's never 100% on the mark.
Yeah, it's a good bridge. We're not talking about, leads and all other things that could be contentious, right? Like we're talking about something that impacts us all and is important to us all, making sure that our company is in good standing.
Yeah, and it's also like why wouldn't you want to be equipped to deal with somebody? Nobody, I've worked in a lot of industries where it's like our optimal operating behavior is no surprises, like anybody who has a Six Sigma kind of mentality. And this fits right into there because if you've ideated cross functionally and thoroughly, there won't be any surprises almost, and maybe everything that could possibly happen.
We love that. That's great. No surprises. All right, Terry, well, is there anything else?
We all went in our personal life too, don't we? I mean, just no surprises.
No,
we tell our kids, whatever you do, don't surprise me. Here's our plan. And I mean, if you think about it, we all do crisis communications. Well, not communications, but planning in our personal lives. You send your kid off to college, you're like, all right, what are all the things that could go wrong? And let me make sure I'm communicating in a way that keeps that from happening.
I have a little while until that happens. I've got about 17 years. So
well, yeah, you have a lot of time to build. You have a lot of time to build your plan, right? And the world will be different. You might as well wait to build it because the world will be very different in 17 years if you think about and that's another reason, by the way, to keep your plan updated is look at the pace of evolution and change that's happening now. There didn't, for crisis planning, even as early or recently as 10 years ago, you wouldn't really have to worry about the immediacy of a message. Like it is out there everywhere. That's another great reason to have a crisis communications plan, because there is no time. It's out there immediately.
Absolutely. Fast moving world.
Across many channels too. That's the other thing that's created some complexity, which is another good reason why make those relationships with market influencers, whoever is shaping the narrative of your industry, whether it's an industry analyst, very influential bloggers, very influential media, which is another good reason to have a outside agency help you with this, because those audiences and those influencers are continuously changing. Someone needs to stay on top of that. And when you're doing day-to-day trying to sell your solutions, you don't really, unless you're a large company and have staffed for all of this, you don't really have the resources to stay ahead of everything you need to stay ahead of.
Yeah, I'm biased, but I agree. And yeah, I mean, it's just great to have like a third party perspective on things, and also someone who has worked with other companies on these very issues, so can point out some blind spots. So good points.
Yeah, and they also have some war stories. Like, if when you're doing your planning and you're like, well, if X happens, I think we need to communicate ABC, you can say, yes, that's an option. And I can see why you think that would be positive. Let me bring up some examples of what could go awry that happened with one of our clients, just so it's a fully informed conversation and decision. So
Definitely. Well, we will. I know we're approaching time, so we'll address any questions afterwards. We've got some great follow up items that we will share with folks who are attending. So, thanks again to everyone who joined us for today's edition of Arketi Live in 25, and thank you to Terry for sharing her insights and time with us. Um, this is an ongoing series, as I think I mentioned at the top. So please keep an eye out for our next episode. We've got one coming in a couple weeks. Another deep dive into a topic specific to B2B marketing and PR. And be sure to, I just so happen to have my handy dandy copy right here. Be sure to check out LinkedIn for details on Arketi's brand new book, The Definitive Guide to B2B Marketing. It's packed with insights we've gathered from years of working alongside some great forward thinking people like Terry. So,
well, I just want to say thank you to Arketi for giving me the segment about what could go wrong instead of all the other topics about things that are going right.
well, we know your Navy SEAL training.
I know, yes, when I was a Navy SEAL, here's what we did. We had to make sure that we could rise to the level of training, not to the occasion.
No, Terry is someone that you want to have in your corner when things go awry.
Everything goes awry. Yeah, that's right.
Great, great
Great
and pressure
brand.
situation.
All right. Well, thanks
All
so
right, everybody.
much.
Until next time, thanks again.
All right. And I'm going to go update my crisis communication
There you
plan.
go.
Okay. It's getting a little dusty.
All right.
See
Thanks,
ya.
everyone.